light's bright. Hi, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for coming along, and thank you to NDC for the very warm welcome today. This talk is called Design for Developers, and the premise of this came about because I am a designer, and I work with a lot of developers, front end, back end, all sorts, over the years. And they've always asked me to share some tips and tricks and ways that they can improve anything that they're working on, whether that is, things we're working on professionally or personal projects or things like that. Now, this has mostly been front-end developers, but hopefully there's something in here for everyone, and hopefully there's some takeaways that you can have from this to add a bit of magic touch to your work. So I've got an hour, just one, so sometimes that feels like ages, and sometimes it doesn't feel like a lot of time at all. But it's not going to be a comprehensive design course here. It's going to be some recurring topics and themes that I've seen and things that I've been asked over the years from developers. So I'm going to cover the following. Some principles, so that's some kind of fundamental rules to follow. Some handy kind of tips around typography, color, bit of imagery stuff, and layout. And then lastly, we're going to look at some before and after examples, so how we can refine some existing designs, and hopefully they're helpful. So before that, thought I'd introduce myself. I'm not a developer like yourself, so I am Lex, and I go by she, her pronouns, and I've just realized now, I usually say it, my handle on everything is @Loftio, but I deleted my Twitter last week, so I don't have that anymore. I've got Blue Sky. I like Blue Sky. Yes. I like that. Although the handles are different on there. I'm sure if you search that, you'd find me on there. And I use LinkedIn for my sins sometimes as well. And I have been a designer for over a decade now. My dad taught me Photoshop at a really young age, unfortunately for me. And then I went to go on and study graphic design, and I ultimately made a move into the agency world, so design agency. And I work at a company called Enzyme at the minute in Nottingham. So that's a little bit of background. So let's get into it. I want to start with the fundamentals, the principles that we need to cover. So this is not an exhaustive list of every rule of design and every one that you need to follow. These are just a handful of key principles that I think are good to keep in mind when you're getting a bit stuck or you're embarking on a design for the first time. So what are those principles? They are hierarchy, proximity, contrast, and balance. So let's start with hierarchy. So similarly to how we think of hierarchy in other aspects of the world, that's a system in which things are arranged according to their importance. So a good design will visually indicate to you what the most important thing is on the page and what that hierarchy of content is. It is a relatively simple principle to implement in design because there are quite a few ways to do it. And one of the easiest ways is scale. So naturally, the biggest thing on the page is probably the most important. But there are other ways that you can do that. You can use color, alignment, repetition, brightness, and contrast as well, which leads me nicely into the next principle. So one in its own right, contrast. Contrast is achieved by having things be opposite or somewhat opposite. It doesn't have to be absolutely opposite to each other. And that's in order to create a sense of emphasis. So one way that we can use contrast in design is to highlight an element on the page against something else, draw the eye to it, make that thing more prominent. And that is how we can relate that back to hierarchy as well. It's a method in which we can achieve that. Other times, though, contrast can just be a very crucial part of the interface. So, especially when it comes to accessibility, as an example. So, text accessibility, we need to have high contrast in order for that to be readable for people who may have, visual impairments, for example. So, contrast is really important for a variety of reasons there. And again, we can use different methods in order to achieve that. We can use color, we can use scale, styles, all sorts to add contrast to our design. So, the next is proximity. So, when it comes to design, proximity is looking at the content that we've got and understanding the relationships that those pieces of content have with each other. And then it's looking at how do we organize that on a page in a way that conveys that visually. So that distance, or the lack of distance between objects, really helps us and in our brains form these connections between different elements of content. So to use text as an example again, if we have a heading and then a paragraph of text underneath that, you can safely say that those two things are going to relate to each other because of their proximities. So proximity, really important principle to follow here because it really helps people digest the content in the correct way by having things belong to each other. The last principle to touch on is balance. So this is what I would call the distribution of visual weight across a screen. This approach in particular is called symmetrical balance, and this is where all of your elements are equal and distributed nicely along the page, often with that kind of invisible center line that you can see down the middle, like balance set scales. But there is also asymmetrical balance, but I'm not going to complicate things. I'm going to keep this simple and talk about symmetrical balance. So balance offers this aesthetically pleasing layout that has consistency, and consistency is always a really good approach in UI design. Users on the web enjoy balance and consistency because it typically reinforces decisions that they're going to make through repetition. If I click this and I click something similar, then the same thing is going to happen most of the time. So balance is a very key principle when it comes to interaction and visual appeal. So these are our 4 design principles to keep in mind when designing. So I suggest that you always kind of return to these and remind yourself of them if you're getting a bit stuck with things. I am 14 years into being a designer, and while most of the time that comes quite naturally, there are times where I just can't see the forest for the trees, and I'm in the midst of a design problem and I don't know where to turn. This is where I come back to. I come back to the fundamentals of things. And I imagine that's a very similar thing when it comes to development. I imagine you get stuck in a problem and you just can't find a way out of it, and you take a step back and then it sort of comes to you. So sometimes, we can overcomplicate things when sometimes the answer is just the most simple one. So that's our principles. Let's take a look at putting these into practice. So I want to go through some tips, tricks, recurring problems that people have when designing for the web across different elements, really common elements that we see. So the first is typography. Now, I don't want to badmouth developers. I don't want to be the designer stood up here, the outcast, badmouthing anyone. But from my experience, this is often where we have problems coming up in testing, and people kind of struggle with typography because it is an art. It's something that you learn over time, but we don't need to make it hard for ourselves. We can try and make this a little bit easier. So, first thing, if we're starting a project, we might have a font, we might need to choose some, might need to add some additional ones. This is kind of the first step. What fonts do we want to include? How do we do that? So my advice for this is to choose a font pairing. I was going to use the word font, typeface, whatever. I'm not going to get pedantic about the terminology. But yes, suggest that you use a font pairing. So this is choosing one for your headings and one font for your more paragraphs or body copy. And this brings that sense of hierarchy. So the visual difference doesn't always rely on sizing. We've got two different fonts to help establish that hierarchy. And it also keeps things simple. There is no real need to exceed more than 2 fonts. It only makes your life more difficult. Plus, developers are always asking me to keep my font choices down to a minimum because it helps with site speed. So we are on the same page, I think. So, headings, let's start here. When it comes to deciding on the font that we choose for the headings, how do we decide that? Well, you can be a bit braver with headings. They can be, a bit bolder, a bit more interesting. We're looking at small bits of copy that are there to be a bit larger and they're attention grabbing, essentially. So you can go with something a bit more stylized, something that adds a bit of character to your type. It still has to be legible, but you can be a bit more decorative with it. Not so much as the font that you decide to choose for your paragraphs. So this is where we need to play it a little bit safer. You're going to need to choose something that is easy to read, and especially at volume. Your paragraphs are smaller text and they appear in larger sections of copy. So it's important that your font does not hinder that reading experience. But where do you start? Still, 2 fonts, great, cool, got it. How do I choose which ones? Well, that comes down to knowing the type of business or brand or project that you are working on. So fonts, especially that heading one, can really embody the brand or the business, or it can complement the style or tone that you're going for. So I can demonstrate that with an example. So this is a small bit of hero copy that you might find atop a website, for example. It's currently, some of my examples are not going to show up well on the screen, but we'll see. It's black and white, and it's not really styled yet. So this is our default. So let's say that the business that we are working for here is antivirus software, for example. Here's how we might style that. So for the heading, I've gone for a font that is quite modern, simple, sleek, a bit techy, but it has a bit of character to it. Where the G and the Y come down, the descenders on those, the little tails, have that kind of uniqueness to them. And then paired with that, I've just gone for this really simple, easy to read sans serif font, and it works really well at smaller sizes. Another element that's really worth thinking about as well, especially when you're looking at that paragraph font, is looking at fonts that have got a number of weights available to them. Here I've got a regular and a bold, which is great because if I want to emphasize certain words, I can do. You might go on the hunt for a font and find some that just have one available weight. And if so, that is a good indicator that it's probably more appropriate for headings or not appropriate at all, really. Definitely don't use it for paragraphs, anyway. But here's one example. What if this copy was not made for the antivirus software? What if it was made for a healthcare business? So in this case, I've chosen a serif font. So it's got that kind of decorative elements to the side of it. It's a little more traditional, but here in particular, it emphasizes that kind of established and trustworthy tone that we're going for with the healthcare vibe. Wow, I've said that on stage now. There isn't any reason why you can't pair a serif and a sans serif font together either. Some people have asked me that question in the past. So once again, I've gone for a fairly simple font for our paragraphs here, that, again, has that couple of weights to it. So while we're using the same bit of copy in both examples, the tone has completely changed, and the font plays a big part in that. I'm not saying it's the only part in that. I've got imagery and I've got color as well, but the font does play a huge part, and it is why designers are obsessed with fonts. If you've got any designer friends, you'll know. They've got a favorite one. Mine is controversial, and I won't say it, so some people know. If you are really stuck and you really just don't know where to start, then I will let you into a little design secret. This is what designers are like most of the time. Just flicking through fonts, just sometimes not knowing which one is right. It isn't an easy thing to do, depending on what you're working on. So our favorite fonts are usually the ones that have got a lot of universal appeal and a lot of application. So fonts like Helvetica, Gotham, Inter. One of them is usually like flavor of the month. Actually, this is probably flavor of the decade. But they're all along the same sort of lines. And the reason why is because they can be used across such a wide range of things. So if you are very, very stuck, you can turn to a font like this. Just don't use Arial, please. However, you shouldn't get stuck because I've got a really good resource to help you out here. And this is called FontPair, fontpair.co. This is a really cool site, and I use it myself. They've got a large range of example pairings, and I think they all use Google Fonts as well, which is, I know, sometimes quite favorable because they're free, so free to license, and a bit of a godsend when you're working on personal stuff as well. But all that text is customizable. You can have a play around and see what works on there without having to download anything, which is always a plus as well. So well worth a look. So, got our fonts. Let's say we've got those. Now we need to take a look at sizing. So, firstly is our paragraph text. So, for paragraph text, I'm going to harp back to accessibility because I'm big on it. It's commonly suggested that 16 pixels or equivalent is the minimum text size you should be using for the right level of contrast. Again, one of those principles we keep coming back to. It's debatable, but if we want to put a hard and fast rule on it, I'd advise 16 pixels minimum. Then for the headings, they also need some sizing applied to them as well. We start looking at hierarchy principle here, so heading 1, biggest size, and then that descends in order, typically. That's an easy way to do it. You can stick to that. There are other ways, you can style them differently, but let's keep it simple. What we're thinking about here, most importantly, is implementing that hierarchy principle. And again, I've got another tool. There's a lot of tried and tested methods out there. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So a great tool for sizing text in general is Typescale. So that's type-scale.com. This is a game changer for me because I suck at maths. I am no good at that. And I like to have a good scale to my type that is in line with like fluid typography, especially for the web. But here you can set your paragraph size initially, and then you can select a scaling method. This one I think is major thirds that I'm showing on the screen, but there are many others. And then it will generate a series of heading sizes based mathematically. It's great. They've all got really nice balance. So again, worth a look, and I think it integrates with Google Fonts as well. And why is that important? Again, comes back to that hierarchy principle, because despite being the first thing on the page, nobody ever reads the top line first. And that is because of hierarchy. It doesn't always come down to the order of things on the page. It comes down to the prominence. So sizing is a big part of that. Okay, moving on from sizing, I'd like to talk about line heights. So this is a really common issue, again, sorry devs, that we run into. Easy to fix though. So here's 3 different examples of line heights to demonstrate the power of getting this right. So a bit of a Goldilocks situation we've got going on here. So at the far end, we have a paragraph there. And the line height here is just, it's too small. The text is slightly bunched together, and that makes it difficult to read. Sometimes our default line spacing can look like this as well, which means we have to go in and fix that. On the other end of the scale, this line height is too much. And it's hard to read in a completely different way. Here we've got a nice middle ground. This is starting to look a bit better. So the line height here is a lot more pleasing to read, and there's enough space, but not too much. And that proximity principle, that's what we need to remember here, especially for that end example. I used to behave like that as a junior designer, and my old boss would say, oh, you can get a bus through those gaps. That has lived with me for over a decade, so it's been drilled in. But yeah, if things are too far away, they don't look like they belong together, and that is the real issue with that last example there. And balance too. Balance comes into play with that last one. That doesn't have that distribution of weight across the page that we kind of talked about with balance. So that's line height. Then I want to look at paragraph spacing, another crime that we come across. And you know, for good reason. It's not always super obvious. So what I mean here by paragraph spacing is the spaces where there are clear breaks. So that's after headings, in between, and after paragraphs. So here we have 2 examples of that. One is good and one is not so good. So let's break down the good example. So in this one, the space between the paragraphs of copy there and after the heading, they can roughly be about the same. And that ensures that that section of text looks like it belongs together, but it still gives those natural breaks, like if you were reading it aloud, how you might naturally pause. Then there's spacing at the end of the paragraph and before the next section, so that needs to be bigger. And that indicates to the user that that section's over. It gives them that natural bit of pause before moving on to the next section, and you can follow that spacing throughout the rest of it. If we compare that to our example on the left, this is where the principle wasn't considered. The spacing of each of these sections, it doesn't help us connect that content together in that logical way. It doesn't have that natural flow like you would if you were reading aloud. And all that different spacing does is just brings inconsistency to the design. There's no balance, and that proximity principle is out the window, basically. Got a rogue bit of animation there. So enough about type, enough about that. We can talk about color now. So what I would like to cover today on color is how to create a color palette. So again, you might be in this position where you've got to start a project from scratch and you need to choose some colors. Or you might have some existing ones that you can work from. But if you're starting from scratch, where the hell do you start with it? So again, let's keep this simple. Like we did with the font choices, keep this simple. Start with one color. That's a really good foundation for you to build upon. And which one color do we start with? This is going to be the main color that you want to associate with your brand or the project that you're working on. And again, if you are stuck here, there are some tried and tested methods and things we can pull from. So let's look at a bit of color theory. This is looking at the types of feelings that are associated with certain colors. So our purple, we've got royalty and luxury, and all the way down to, your oranges, which is quite warm and successful and creative, and then down into black, which is stable and powerful and things like that. So I haven't worked with these brands. I'm not saying that they have chosen these colors because of this, but it's probably Some of them probably have. Dairy Milk have probably looked at purple and thought, yeah, this was years and years ago, that it's quite luxurious, so much that I think they've trademarked their purple. I feel like they have. McDonald's might have gone with the yellow because of happiness, Happy Meal, all that. But it's not always why brands choose the colors. But again, it is a very, very good place to start. If you are stuck and you don't know which color to go for, have a look at the kind of feelings that you want that to evoke. So, once we've picked one, once we've picked a main color, then we can start to build out our palettes from there. It's a great foundation to start with. So, we start with a main palette, and this will be that color you've picked out, and then a very small selection of other commonly used colors. You can then have a supporting palette. This might be a wider range of colors, but that you use a bit less. And then there is neutrals. So this will be your less commonly used colors, but they're there to allow a bit of flexibility. They'll be based off of some of your main colors or supporting ones as well. So I'd like to just, again, show an example of this using a brand that most of us may have come into contact with. So that's Uber. So this is Uber's main color palette. Again, the lights probably aren't so good at showing this, but they started with black. So that's the color they started with. Then they'll have added the white, and the reason they'll have added that is because it has really good contrast with the black. It is the complete opposite to it. And then additionally, and as their third main color, kept it at 3, they have a blue. And this works well with the black or the white. Black and white naturally does work well with most things. But they use this one more sparingly, but with a lot of purpose, and that's why it belongs in that main palette. Again, you might not be able to see. Ignore my Uber rating. Actually, it's not that bad. This has been updated. It's a lot better now. I have some rogue friends that come home from nights out and ruin my rating. It's not me, I promise. But the blue is used on the app, particularly with purpose, where I have a message and there's a little blue notification, and then there's this safety checkup bit, which is things I need to complete. So it's asking me to do some actions. So a very purposeful use of the color. Then we take a look at their supporting palette. So this is that second supporting palette where I mentioned you could add more additional colors to it. They have twice as many here. But they're used a lot less within the branding. You might not have even realized that they had all these colors. So they're used for supporting content, such as their illustrations, which they use here. Colors like the green from this palette actually have evolved for Uber, so they use that a lot for like their Uber Eats division. That's all in green. But it doesn't belong in the main palette, not for the main Uber brand anyway. And that's because they use it sparingly. They use it to show Uber Eats, and that's about it. And then lastly, we have a set of neutral shades. So this is where we have the ability to add a bit more depth to the palette. It can show different levels of depth, and it can also help with that sense of hierarchy. And you can't see them very well on this screen. The search bar has a very light grey to it, which looks white, I think, from here. These slides will be available after the talk. So the neutrals don't show grey on this. But yes, that allows a lot more depth. It gives you a lot more flexibility in your palette. It also is very useful if you need more contrast as well. It also helps create a sense of hierarchy with your different color palettes working in different places. So, quick tip on creating those neutrals as well. It shows up okay on here. Take a look at your main palette. What kind of tones are you using in there? Are you using more cool tones, like your blues, for example? Then I would make sure that your neutrals follow the same sort of tone. So add a little tinge of blue in your grays and your shades that you're going to create in the neutrals works really well. And If it's warmer, say it's orange, for example, you might want to include a little tinge of orange in your lighter shades as well. And that just means that it complements the rest of your palette. So, for choosing colors, I have another tool. I have tools for most things. And these are all things that I use as well on a day-to-day. So this is Adobe Colors. This is free. You do not need an Adobe subscription. Nobody wants to sign up to that. Even I don't want to have an Adobe subscription these days. I use this a lot because creating an entire palette is scary, but this tool in particular lets you create palettes using one color as a starting point, like I just spoke about. And you can apply different harmony rules to this, so you can choose contrasting colors, that kind of opposite that we talked about. You can have complementary or companion colors, so ones that are a bit closer to each other. There are lots of different methods on here that you can choose. We've got monochromatic. Wow, I'm not wearing my glasses. But yeah, there's lots of tried and tested approaches, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Use these tools if you can. It does also have shades, which is really helpful for creating that neutral palette as well. But word of warning, I'm going to come back to accessibility here. Accessibility is a priority for us designers when we are choosing colors. There's a range of things we need to get right, but this is one of the easiest ones, so it should not be overlooked. You might have created that beautiful palette and then you don't have enough contrast when it comes to the web. This is why those neutrals are really important. They can help you with that variation. So I would suggest testing your colors on a site. This is the web AIM, however you want to say it, .org/resources/contrast checker. And you can test colors here. So you put in a foreground and a background color, and it will tell you whether it passes the WCAG standards. That's AA and AAA that they have on there. And I usually try and aim for AAA. Sometimes it's hard, especially if you choose orange. Orange is an interesting color when it comes to contrast. I won't go into that more, but yeah, this is an instance in design where contrast is not just that nice principle to come back to. This is where it is crucial for the web, and it's crucial to get this right so that it's accessible for everyone. So on that line of thinking, we shouldn't rely on color as a sole indicator for something that we're trying to convey to a user. Some people will not see color the same as you do. Might be a level of color blindness there. Therefore, we need to give them more indication. So this is a list of tasks that I've got to do with a status attached to them. So one is marked in red, which I haven't quite completed yet, and one is marked in green, which I have. But color here is not enough to indicate the status of each of these. You might have people that see these colors completely differently, so even as far as not even being able to see color at all. Sometimes I've used stuff on my phone in black and white mode. After 11 p.m., if I'm still on my phone, it will go black and white, which is mostly to tell me to go to sleep, but also helps, I think. Helps your eyesight? Who knows? So yeah, there is a whole host of reasons. It's not just if people are colorblind as well. There are other instances where this is just an access for all issue as well. These are on. So instead, what can we do? We can accompany these colors with an icon, and that helps us give more context to that content, and it helps if there is no color or there's a difficulty seeing that color as well. But there's another word of warning when it comes to icons. So we'll move on to icons now. Iconography. This is an age-old way of communicating things. You know, you've seen it on toilet signs and road signs and everywhere on the web. But with icons, it is very easy for us to assume that a user will know what our icon is just because we do. We're working on something, we know what it means. we know exactly what it means, but the user might not. There are some icons, though, like these, which we see every day, and it's pretty well known what they mean. These are, I'm going to click this, and I know what's going to happen. This is going to be search, this is going to be a menu, this is going to be a delete action. These are called universal icons because they are very well known. We know what's going to happen. Now, we consider what these icons might do, or what they might represent. They might not be as familiar, they might not be as obvious, or we might think that they are. So the heart could mean like, that one in the middle could be a repost. The last one could be a link to the live chat. Or it might not be. These could be something completely different. So, with icons that are not immediately obvious to us, the best thing to do is to give these a label, which, some people don't like the idea of that because sometimes we're using icons to save space. But if it isn't immediately obvious and you're not sure if it is best to fall back on that labeling. So in the case of my task list here, it might be nice to have an indicator next to that icon as well. We've gone from just having a colored dot to then having an icon and then having a label, really making sure that someone knows exactly what's going to happen. So it might not always be a requirement. Might have gotten away with the icons, to be honest. But it is better to assume that an icon isn't universal if you're not sure about it. So, moving on from icons, this kind of covers it as well. I would like to touch generally on using imagery on the web and in your projects and stuff in the year 2025. So, typically, if you don't have your own imagery, nothing that you've created, you might go to a stock imagery site. This has been the norm for a while. You can license photos, you can license illustrations, you can license icons. They're from different sources such as iStock, Shutterstock. Icons you can do from Noun Project and Font Awesome and things like that. Other photos, Unsplash and Pexels. All are really, really good resources. They're fully licensed for you to use. That's a very important thing. No one wants to get in trouble. And the last two that I mentioned actually are free to use as well as having licensing. So Unsplash and Pexels. Pexels has video as well, which is really, really good. These are free to use. They do have some paid ones, but they have a huge library of free images and videos to use. So these are a great tool. But in the year 2025, you might decide that you want to pursue some AI imagery for your website. I really don't want to get into a debate on the stage about the ethics of generative AI imagery. I will be at the after party if anyone wants to talk about it, though. But let's keep it real. I wouldn't advise using solely AI-generated imagery, something like DALL-E or Midjourney, in the hopes that that imagery might fit the bill. I would always advise trying something else first, if you can. Ethically, slipped into it, these images are trained on models that steal artwork, and I'm very against that. Plain and simple. We'll discuss later. But practically, your images just don't look very genuine because they're not. There's this glossy sheen to them. If you're generating pictures of people, they can have that like uncanny valley look to them and dead behind the eyes. And God forbid, if you want to generate text via AI, ta-da! Anyway, it is getting closer. Fair enough to it. But, biggest thing, I mostly just find AI images very obviously AI. And that's a trust thing. Like, I think it just doesn't look great. If you can, from an image point of view, it's a huge part of creating designs. You need to have imagery. You need to have things like graphics and icons. These are sources. There are plenty out there that you can pull from. So please go there first before before using AI. However, on AI's side, my one big use for generative AI in images is to extend imagery, stuff that you already have and already exists. Because this has been a really, really manual process using Photoshop, where you'd try and add a bit of extra. You try and use the clone tool, where you have to like copy a bit of image, and yeah, it gets tedious. But to demo that, this is a picture that my friend sent me. He's getting married, and he wanted me to do a save the date card for him. I said, sure. Is there a picture you want on it? Yes, he sent me this. I was like, great, but there's nowhere for me to put the text on this image. I can use it in a different way, but he really wanted the text on the image. So this is where I had to, a decade ago, more than that, a few years ago, I would have been clone tooling this, and I would have spent hours and hours extending this image out. But Photoshop has this thing now where you can extend the image. So I did that, extended it out. I did do a little bit of manual stuff. There was a van in the background. I retouched that one out myself. But the edges and the shadow as well. There's a shadow of someone taking a picture. No one ever notices that, but yes. So, my point. AI has made that manual process a lot less tedious, which is where I see it being useful. Not the full images that they generate, but yeah. I want AI to steal the boring jobs, not the ones that I actually like doing, so hopefully that's not in danger yet. But I mention this because it can be useful on the web as well. We can extend images where we've got, a place where we need to put a landscape photo, we've got a portrait one, we need to extend that out. It can be quite useful. And it's not just, I'm talking about Photoshop, it does it really well. There are other tools that you can use that don't come with a hefty subscription as well. Anyway, enough about that. Rambled on about AI. I'm sure you've heard plenty of AI stuff today. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Let's get back to design. So let's talk about layout. And this is where we start putting some stuff down on a page. So when I start with that dreaded blank page, which is the scariest thing in the world, I like to start with a grid, or at least columns. And these can give you a real guide on where to place elements on a page. Now, typically, it is good to use a column structure that's divisible by a lot of different numbers. I said I was rubbish at math. My American maths. I can divide by 12. This is a 12-column grid is really good because it's divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6, 1, and itself, I guess, as well. And this makes it really, really versatile for responsive design, but it also helps us maintain that balance principle that we spoke about at the start. So this is typical 12-column layout. I know that this is not a revolutionary concept in front-end development. It is even less of a modern concept in design. Grid systems and column systems have been going since they've been printing books, which is a long time. So designers, we've been familiar with this. But anyway, this sets a structure in our design. It's a set of rules to follow again. Very, very big on the rules up here today, not usually in real life. But gives us something to come back to, something to guide us and assist us in maintaining that balance and proximity that we talked about. So here's how we can create 2 column sections, and this might be 2 columns of text, it might be some images. We can divide that by 3. We might have some product cards or something in here. Divide by 4. This one's my favorite for balance and responsive. I like that one. Or even 6. So this is good if we need like smaller elements on a page. And of course, I'm talking about this looking at a large screen size. Once you then start to go down, this is where things start to stack in that grid, and you come down in size. What is good about this is that you can asymmetrically balance your layout. That's the one I didn't talk about at the start. I won't go into detail, but this is an example of that. So on the left, you might have a sidebar, you might have like a menu or something, and this area on the right there still maintains that nice balance, and that's because they all follow that same consistent layout with the columns here. So great starting point, gives you a clear guide on where to put stuff. Now, speaking of stuff, I want to talk about the value of repetition, and that's especially along those columns or a grid system that you have. So repetition, really, really massive tool in UI design. It brings that unity, it brings that cohesiveness to a design, that consistency, and it gives, like I said at the start, it gives users that clear idea of what to anticipate when they're browsing and when they're making any actions as well. It also makes the developers I work with quite happy as well, because they can reuse components, build it once, and don't have to build it multiple times. So, how do we start building out a piece of our design, a little component? Again, let's keep it simple. Let's start small and then build up from there. Always a good place to start. So, I really like the atomic design methodology. This, again, it's another set of rules to follow a little bit when you're making components. This methodology is quite well known. I'm not standing up here and thinking that there will not be plenty of people in the room that haven't heard of this. It's an oldie, but a goodie. But, there's a link at the top if anyone wants to go fully delve into this as well. But to simplify it for those of you who haven't heard of it, atomic design uses the following naming convention here to describe how we would build out a component. So starting small, we have atoms, then we have molecules, and then we have organisms. I spelled that right, good. And then that builds up further to pages and templates. So if we start with the atoms, what are the atoms? These are the most basic building blocks for an interface. So this is the singular elements that we use. So let's take an example here. I'm building an e-commerce website. The atoms here could be the image, the title, and the price tag. 3 atoms there. And like atoms in nature, they're cool, they're important, but they're not very good on their own. So this is then where we have molecules. So molecules is where 2 or more atoms combine in order to create a slightly larger, more functional piece of that interface. So this is where our single atoms that we have here, they merge, and then they become a molecule. This is something a bit more put together. We're starting to see something take shape here now. And then lastly, we have organisms. So in a similar fashion to what we had with molecules, organisms are made up of 2 or more molecules combining. So if I quickly just make another molecule here out of my atoms, ta-da, now I have 2 molecules and I can combine them, and then we've got an organism. Now this is like a product card. This is a full reusable component that we can use within our design. So come back to our columns. We can start to look at how we would lay this out on a page. So we take our organism, we repeat that across the columns, and then we've got something. And then we do it again. And then we add some other ones. And then we're starting to build a full page here. So there is that sense of familiarity when we create those components. Each time I click one of these, it's going to be the same thing that happens. There's also that balance. So from a design point of view, it looks good. It looks good. There's consistency to it. Things aren't all over the place. It's great. And the upside is we only have to design that component once, and we can use it again and again. Balance. Yeah, that repetition really does mean that we need to consider that alignment. And this is where those columns are so important. And it, again, comes to that proximity principle. When you have elements like this, you need to consider where they're going to go on the page. And a really good way of doing that is just making sure that things line up with each other. This example on the right, for example, these things all align on the left side, but those middle ones also align to the same top line as well. This one is a mess. This is not good. And the reason is the proximity principle. You know, these things are laid out nicely in a grid. We can assume that some of these things belong to each other, whereas when they're a bit scattered, it's not always clear. Oh, balance. So, I know you've probably all worked on repeating components, and atomic design is not a new thing, but the reason that I bring up these things is because it just invites us to take our time with these things and consider each element by starting off really small. Same with the typography, the same with the colors. Start with one, start small. Design is hard, but it doesn't have to be. We don't need to be overwhelmed with that blank page. I know I've sat in front of a blank screen, and it's the scariest thing to start a design without really having anything to go off. So whether you're a designer or whether you're a developer or whether you're something completely in between and you want to create something, start small. We get those little things right first, then the websites or the other things, the projects will all follow. So that's all great if you're starting from scratch. How can you apply this to existing designs, things that you've worked on and you want to improve? You might be thinking of something that you're working on now and going, okay, yeah, I've got some ideas now. I want to show some examples of that. So this is where I've had the best feedback from devs as well, shown a before and after of things and explained how we've improved and why, more importantly. So let's take a look at some examples. This is a card component, an organism, if you will. Here is one from a property website. So I have got all the information I need on this card. I've got the price, I've got the location, I've got the spec, image gallery, the button, call to action on there as well. Actually, it's not a button, it's a link. But what we're really lacking is good hierarchy, good contrast, nice balance to this. So let's have a look at how we can improve that. Yeah, you can't see my neutrals on this. That's fine, that's fine. Still works. So both these cards, they display the same information pretty much, apart from the logo. But they perform the same function as well. But the big difference is in how we use design to communicate. So first thing, price. We have identified price as the key element that we want to pull out as the most important. So we've made that bigger, we've bolded it, we're thinking about the hierarchy. I've used some icons as well, bit of nice visual interest there, but I've pulled out some of that key information. Again, it makes it a bit more prominent to the user. There's a bit more contrast there, and I have labeled the icons just in case someone doesn't know what the shower indicates. It could be bathroom, it could be shower room, it could be something else. Some people have saunas these days, which is cool. Contrast, the contact details, for example. This is, you can't really see it on here, but I have got a neutral tone just at the bottom of this card. But the big thing with contrast here is that I've changed that link into a nice big button, and it is using that main purple color. I've also added in the logo there. That's mostly for a bit of trust and familiarity, but again, it's also quite visually contrasting there. Lastly, I've adjusted the controls on the gallery here. So you can click through and view multiple images on this gallery, which you could do on the first example with the controls underneath. But what I've done here is I've placed the controls on the image. That's that proximity thing we're talking about. The controls are on the image. I know that these controls are going to control that image gallery. Lets you know what that relates to. So small, incremental sort of changes on here can really help improve. So another example. Let's look at a little modal here. So what is the problem with this example here? This is a permanent destructive action, and the warning for it is, do you know what? On this screen, it's massive, but on my screen, it's really small. Just imagine that scaled down to your monitor size. So the destructive warning it's there, but it's not exactly prominent. And the buttons here have no real differentiation to help us make our decision at a glance. Yes, it's there in the text. But there's a lot of mental load for that user at this stage. So let's improve it. What can we change about this to improve it? Doesn't seem like there's a lot at first, but there are some things we can do. So the warning text, the little texts, we've made that a bit bigger, we've moved it up the page, and most importantly, I've also accompanied it with an icon. I've tried to make that a bit more eye-catching to the user and made sure that they've read it, they understand. Secondly, I've adjusted the text on the buttons as well. The yes, no can sometimes be a bit confusing, so rather than say that, I've gone with delete or cancel, and I've also swapped the buttons around as well. Typically, main action on the right is quite a familiar pattern. It's not always the case, but just another one to think about. But most importantly is the styling on these buttons. So one is in red, which goes against what I said earlier, but it could be green, it could be blue, it doesn't really matter. The difference here is that we've got contrast with these buttons. One is filled, it is a filled, thicker kind of button, and the secondary action is in this outline button. So what that is it gives a sense of hierarchy, it uses contrast to do that, and it means that one action is a bit more pulled out, a bit more prominent than the other one. And that really helps a user make a very quick decision. We're giving them more context than just, here's some text, make your decision. We're using design as a tool to help them make that decision without having to do much reading, which in this day and age, lots of people do skim read and make their decisions without reading everything. I am guilty of that as well. For our next example here, how do we make a radio button choice a bit more interesting? The age-old question. This seems fine. Like, this is fine. There's nothing wrong with this, but we can still improve it. So let's consider the hierarchy. What is the big difference here in our choices? So this is for a data plan. So the amount of data that you get is the largest differentiator. So that's the thing that we want to pull out. That's the thing we want to be the most prominent. So let's make that big. Let's make it bold. Secondly, we put these choices into nice big block components. So what that does is it creates a sense of balance in the layout, but it also really separates those options a bit better than the radio button. And lastly, our selected state here. This invites that level of contrast in comparison to the previous example. It is very clear which one has been chosen. We haven't just used color, we've used an underline, and we've used an icon as well. So there's multiple things that say this is the chosen one. So again, those simple incremental changes can really enhance choices like these, make the user's experience just a little more enjoyable. Both very functional, but very different in style. This is just a very quick example of how we can add a bit of interest to a simple block of text. This is not a bad example by any means, but we can sharpen it up. So again, our example here, I've chosen some different font weights for those headings, just made it a little more interesting as well. We've got a bit more contrast and we can highlight what's important on that page. Thinking about proximities on this as well, the spacing is a little off from when we were talking about paragraph spacing before. This example here is a little off. So we've tidied that up and made sure that that is consistent. Lastly, I've just read the content and decided to do something a bit more interesting with it as well. So bullet points are fine. In fact, bullet points are great. They help break down content. But in this example, we can maybe be a bit more interesting than a simple bullet point. It might be that we have some steps to follow, in which case we can number them. It also allows us to maybe use some other colors that we've got in our palette as well. So it really helps with that visual interest, but also the balance and the flow of that content as well. Like I said, neither one is wrong, but I know which one I prefer. Lastly, this is my last example, and then I'll leave you guys to it. This is a hero section on a website. So this is the first thing you see when you're going to come to a website. So we've got an image, we've got title, description, 2 buttons, and a menu. Now this, it's okay, but I can't see the cat, which means that this design, doomed. So how do we fix that? So the biggest thing for me here is that the text over the image is sort of readable, but it's not all the way. We could do better than that. We're using this overlay over the image, and the two things, the text and the image, are just fighting against each other, to be honest. And yes, it obscures the cat, so jail. This revised example uses that available space that we've got with the background image here. So we move the cat over, we get a better crop. This is where we can use that generative AI if we need to extend images. I'm not creating a cat from AI, I'm just extending the background. And that gives this design now a lot more contrast. Text is easier to read. We've got that correct color contrast here as well. I've thought about the hierarchy of the buttons, so made one more prominent than the other. And I've also done that on the menu as well. That's where I can put that overlay. It's only obscuring the cat's tail, so that's okay. So again, yeah, small incremental changes that we can make here. And they all come back to these principles. So if we keep coming back to these, you can make these improvements as well. If you have missed any of these resources or want to check out any slides or anything, I have them on Noticed. I will post them on my Blue Sky. Is that the best way to link Blue Sky? I have no idea. Who knows? And I also have a website, which is on as well, which I update all the time. So yeah, if there's any feedback, there are cards outside, as you've seen already. Please be honest. And if you have any further feedback, questions, come and ask me afterwards. I will be at the after party. Thank you very much.